false ribs because they do not reach the sternum in front. Now there are two more pairs, right? 11th and 12th. 11th and 12th pairs are called floating ribs. Floating ribs. Now these 11th and 12th pairs do not even come forward or anteriorly. They do not form this cartilaginous connection with the previous ribs. They just come out from the vertebral column and they float. The tip is covered by a costal cartilage and that's it. They do not come anteriorly at all. Therefore, you have 12 pairs of ribs. 1st to 7th pairs of ribs are called true ribs. They articulate with the vertebral column posteriorly and sternum anteriorly. The 8th to 10th pairs of ribs are called false ribs. They articulate with the vertebral column posteriorly, but they fall short of the sternum in front. They articulate with the 7th rib by costal cartilages, by a strip of cartilage. Then 11th and 12th pair of ribs are called floating ribs. So these are the three types of ribs that we have. Now we come to the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle or the pelvic cage is obviously in the lower part of the axial skeleton. It is below the pectoral girdle. Now the floating ribs appear in the abdomen or abdominal cavity. They are not complete in front. Therefore, the upper part of the pelvic girdle is open. The upper part of this pelvic girdle is open. The pelvic girdle is actually made of by two hip bones. Two hip bones by the side. Each hip bone is made of by fusion of three bones. Each hip bone is made of by fusion of the pubis, ischium, the iliac bone. Each hip bone is made of by fusion of the pubis bone, the ischium and the ilium. The ischium and the iliac bone. Now the two hip bones are joined in the center by a pubic symphysis. A pubic symphysis. This pubic symphysis is the anterior boundary of the pelvic girdle. You have the two hip bones at the side and posteriorly you have the sacrum. Posteriorly you have the sacrum. So these are the parts of the pelvic girdle. It has the pubic symphysis in front, the two pubic bones or the two hip bones at the side, and you have the sacrum at the back or posteriorly. These are the parts of the pelvic girdle. Now what is the purpose of dividing the body or the skeleton into these parts? We see that each bony cage has a cavity inside which protects soft parts. For example, the skull has the cranial cavity where the brain is accommodated. Yes, the cranial cavity has the brain. The continuation of the brain is the spinal cord. The spinal cord continues from the skull or from the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum into the neural canal of the vertebral column. Each vertebra at its posterior end has an opening called the neural canal. The spinal cord passes through this canal. Now the spinal cord and the brain is enclosed in this bony cavity. The skull enclosed in the cranial cavity and the spinal cord enclosed in the vertebral cavity. Now in the pectoral girdle, the heart, lungs, major blood vessels, the esophagus, stomach, the diaphragm, all the soft parts or viscera are accommodated inside the pectoral girdle. This is for protection against trauma. Second thing is it allows for expansion of the lung. When we take in air or we inspire air, the lungs expand and the ribs expand along with the inspiration to allow the lungs to expand. Therefore, the purpose of this cage or girdle is to enclose, protect and accommodate these soft parts or viscera. The same is true for the pelvic girdle. The urogenital tract is enclosed and protected inside the pelvic girdle. This pelvic girdle and pectoral girdle gives attachment to the appendicular skeleton. The upper limb bones are attached to the trunk at the pectoral girdle, and the lower limb bones are attached to the pelvic girdle. So these also give attachment to the appendicular skeleton. Let's now classify the bones. There are different types of bones, first classified based on size. Based on size, you can classify the bones as short bones, long bones, flat bones and sesamoid bones. Short bones. Obviously, the size of the bone is small or they are short in length. For example, carpal bones or bones of the wrist joint or bones of the ankle joint, which are called the tarsal bones. Carpals, that's the wrist. Tarsals, that's the ankle bones. Those are examples of short bones. Also, the bones of the digits or phalanges. The bones of the digits or phalanges. Next you have long bones. All the long bones in your body, that is the bones of the upper arm, thigh, leg, etc. The bone of the upper arm is called humerus. The bone of the thigh is called the femur. These are the single long bones that are present in your body. The thigh bone or the femur is the single largest, strongest or the biggest bone in your entire body. The femur is the biggest bone in your entire body. You also have long bones like radius and ulna in the forearm. So those are your long bones. Femur, humerus, radius, the ulna, etc. Next you have flat bones. These are mostly the bones present in the axial skeleton. For example, skull, ribs, vertebral column, pelvic girdle bones, etc. All of them come under flat bones. The last thing is sesamoid. Sesamoid bone or the bone that is shaped like a sesame seed or a till seed. The most common example or the most important example is the bone in your kneecap, that's called the patella. That is the most important sesamoid bone. The patella or kneecap, that is your sesamoid bone. Therefore, the classification on the bones based on size, you will find short bones, long bones, flat bones, sesamoid bones. Let's now look at the parts of a long bone. The long bone has an articulating surface which may be called a head. It has a shaft, that would be the articulating surface. Two articulating surfaces of a long bone. They are curved and the shaft is straight. This is called the shaft. Now when we look at the parts of a long bone, we can see that the two ends of the bone which are flattened and modified for articulation are called epiphyses. singular is called SIS, epiphysis. A plural would be SES, epiphysis. Okay, so 2 epiphyses for a long bone. Those are the ends of the bone. Yes, the middle of the bone is called a shaft. This is called the diaphysis. Now the area at the junction between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is called metaphysis. It's called the metaphysis. It is at the junction between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. This area, this thin area will be called the metaphysis or metaphyseal plate. Now what is the importance of these 3 areas? Epiphysis of the bone are the articulating surfaces of the bone. They form the joint. The diaphysis of the bone, within it has a cavity. If you take a big knife and you cut the bone in the middle and you open it out, you will find a cavity in the diaphysis called the cavity in the center is called the medullary cavity. It's called the medullary cavity. This is the seat of hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis is nothing but production of blood and its cells. Therefore, medullary cavity of the diaphysis produces blood and its cells. This is called the hemopoietic center in the bone that is present in the diaphysis. Next you have the metaphysis. The purpose of the metaphysis is growth of the bone. When a child increases in stature or when a child grows tall, what is the area of the bone that increases in length? It increases at the metaphysis. The growth of the metaphysis contributes to the growth of the bone. So this is the growing area of the bone. After a certain point in time, for example, after 18 years of age, everybody stops growing in height. That is the time when the metaphyseal plate disappears. The metaphyseal plate disappears and your height stays static. That is the time where the metaphyseal plate disappears. So these are the 3 parts of the long bone and the functions of the same. Epiphysis is the articulating surface of the bone. Diaphysis has the medullary cavity, which is the hemopoietic center of the bone. This has the bone marrow. It has the bone marrow. This is the red area inside the bone which produces blood. And the metaphysis or the metaphyseal plate is the growth area of the long bone. Now, depending on the density of the bone, bones can be classified as compact or spongy bones. Based on the density of the bone, you can classify them as compact bone and cancellous or spongy bone. Now, the area where 2 bones meet, it's called a joint. These bones, which are not in continuation with each other, but they have to act as a physiological unit or a functional unit. Now, how do they do that? They act by forming a joint and by the application of the muscles on top of the bones. They actually act as one single unit for facilitation of locomotion. We can do a lot of different activities because of these joints which are present in our body. Therefore, a joint is an area